Islam and the American Christian community joining hand in hand, picketing outside Chase Manhattan Bank in New York, literally burning Rockefeller in effigy. That's a tribute to the great effort of American counterintelligence, persuasion technology research efforts funded by Rockefeller and Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, who paid Massachusetts Institute of Technology $200,000 a year during the 1960s under the neurosciences umbrella. How noble. For, quote, public management, mass persuasion technologies research, brainwashing. So, the Dulles brothers, besides, remember I told you that not only what you know about AIDS is a deception, what you know about virtually everything is a deception. It was the Dulles brothers that clearly engineered the Cold War. Not only was the Rockefellers making money off of every side of every war of this whole past century, but it wasn't enough after World War II. They had to create another war called the Cold War. You see, the game was to separate people, divide and conquer the sheeple. Yeah. Divide the sheeple to conquer the flock. You know, the international banksters. They make money off of both sides of every war. That's why we have the rifts that we do between the nations. They funded the Marxist, Marx, Lenin, communism. They separate communist from socialist, from capitalist, Democrat from Republican, reform from liberal, conservative. You see, they play it off against one another. White from black, rich from poor, black, HIV positive from HIV negative, gay from straight, Christian from Muslim, Jew from Gentile. That's the game, folks. Time we wake up. We've been had. They manipulate. The game is manipulate through fear. Today somebody on radio called up and were discussing, like, am I spreading fear needlessly? My response should have been, you're a cult member and you don't even know who your cult leader is. You know, they made me the cult leader. This is funny. Warner Brothers, about 3 weeks ago on national television, they made me the new cult leader of all of the crazy lunatic cult members who believe that the AIDS and Ebola viruses are man-made. How about that? I have a great cult following. My 2-year-old and 5-year-old, and my wife supporting me. That's my cult. That's my cult. So, at any rate, you see, this is the Rockefeller Military Medical Industrial Complex. Now, the Rockefeller group began to fund in 1920s not only the Flexner Report, which outlawed all of the other alternatives to pharmaceutical medicine and healing. But in fact, it's an insult that we have to call what we do frequently alternative. The herbs, acupuncture, chiropractic. This is alternative medicine. The only reason it's called alternative medicine is because the Rockefellers, they funded the Flexner Report, which then went around the schools and then legislation saying that these people should be outlawed, not allowed to practice. It was the Rockefellers, you see, also that started the cancer industry. How did they do that? Oh, well, they found that cancer was an up-and-coming thing. There was a Rous sarcoma virus that they discovered in the early 1900s, a chicken sarcoma, and that they felt that viruses might be associated with cancers in humans. They knew it in animals now, and they started an industry. And what they did is, and I wrote about this in the book, Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, they got Mary Lasker. They called her Mary and her Little Lambs. Mary Lasker's husband was one of New York City's chief advertising agents. And so they hired Mary to get involved, and they played on the emotions and the heartstrings of Americans, saying that, showing pictures of disabled children, cancer-ridden people, And as a result of that, you know, we gave a lot of money, you and I, and our parents did, to cancer research, the American Cancer Society. Meanwhile, we were just funding the Rockefellers, literally funding the Rockefellers and/or their agendas. They also started in the 1920s, early 1920s, what was called eugenics. The research that showed that there were differences between the races genetically. And this gave rise to the racial hygiene laws in the United States. In fact, if you were a black man in the United States in the 1920s and you wanted to marry a white woman, if you were in the South, you'd likely be hung. In the North, you'd be jailed, as just like a white man would be if he wanted to marry a black woman. And this was allegedly based on sound scientific evidence funded by Rockefellers that showed that blacks were genetically inferior to whites and the races should not mix. And now in 1928, Rockefeller's got a little bit more money to spend on this project. So he builds the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Eugenics in Germany. And this becomes the world's preeminent eugenics research facility, institute, and that this now gives rise to the people and the racial hygiene agenda that supported Hitler and his rise to power with his racial hygiene agenda. So in 1932, when Hitler co-authors Mein Kampf, what does he tell you right in Mein Kampf? To raise money for his political agenda, he tells us, oh, I am not a bad man, I am not doing anything wrong, I'm not doing anything unusual. Let's look at, for example, I take my lead from the Rockefeller-funded research that shows that obviously blacks are genetically inferior to whites, and he adds Jews. So that a few years later, 1938, you have the purging of the European universities of the Jewish professors. And where do you think these people went? They went, many of them, they came to the United States. They went to work, for example, Rockefeller University. They went to work for Cold Springs Harbor Research Laboratories in New York, supported and funded by Rockefeller Foundation, Sloan Foundation, and others. They went to work for Yale University, where they have today the leading virology department. And they went to work for the University of Chicago, built by Rockefeller money. By the way, that's exactly where Dr. Robert Gallo came from, University of Chicago. And so this research continues over here. At the same time, it's ongoing over there. And during the Holocaust, you have the most hideous experiments in the history of mankind, humanity. Mild among the thousands of horrific experiments, they take large gauge needles, they jab it into an eye of a living human being without anesthetic, and they extract a little eye color sample. And then they do genetic analysis on it to find out which genes are associated with eye color. That's mild comparison to the other things. If you don't believe me, go to Washington, D.C. sometime. Go to the National Holocaust Museum. You see there, not only do they show you pictures, but they show you the medical artifacts. You literally see what they were using for tools to do this type of experimentation. So, after the war, eugenics gets a bad name. Surprise, surprise. It gets a bad name. So what do? They have to change the name. They call it the Human Genome Project. Great name. The Human Genome Project. And it continues full speed ahead at Cold Springs Harbor Laboratory, where approximately 2 years ago, they finally announced we have virtually completed the analysis of the entire human genome. Gene for gene, we now know the human being's DNA sequence. And now, because of this knowledge, we will be able to be much closer to developing effective cures for specific genes that cause specific predispositions for diseases in certain races even. Now that's why every month or so you're reading in your newspaper, gene for breast cancer in Jewish women discovered. Or gene for sickle cell anemia in black people discovered. So isn't it interesting how frequently it's genes for Jews and genes for blacks that they're discovering? Now you understand maybe why. So when I talked to Gallo, one of the things that he put on tape, and I knew also that that was true. In fact,